Hey everyone, this is a section of part 1 of Guy Debord by Anselm Jappe. Part 1 is titled The Concept of the Spectacle. This part, which is a little bit larger than a typical chapter, it's like 50 pages or something like that, is a little long for a YouTube video. Not that all my YouTube videos are short, but it's definitely a thing that people are more likely to listen to things that are short. And I'd rather have a few people listen to, like, I don't know, maybe like one of these sections and not the other ones, as opposed to not listening to any of them because the video that they're contained within is too long. And it's also like a little bit more in terms of like getting people to actually look at these videos. It's kind of like it's an advertisement for for the channel to have more videos than just one, especially when you space them out. So that's my self-serving purpose for cutting these down into smaller chunks. The last section, if you're trying to listen to these in chronological order, was titled The Spectacle of the Highest Stage of Abstraction. And this section is titled Debord and Lukács. I don't know if I said the title of part 1, but the title of part 1 is The Concept of the Spectacle. So, Debord and Lukács, let's go. Marxian thought is thus at once a record and a critique of the reduction of all human life to value. That is to say, to the economy and the economy's laws. Nevertheless, generations of Marx's adversaries and followers have interpreted his testimony as an apology for this reduction. It must seem surprising from their point of view that Debord should invoke Marx at the same time deem the economic sphere antagonistic to the totality of life. Debord, however, can legitimately lay claim to illustrious predecessors in his interpretation of Marx. One of these is Georg Lukács, who writes, quote, "It is not the primacy of economic motives in historical explanation that constitutes the decisive difference between Marxism and bourgeois thought, but the point of view of totality," end quote. This, quote, point of view, end quote, is for Lukács closely bound up with the rediscovery of the, quote, fetishism of the commodity, end quote. The return of this concept, at least as a modish term, began in the 1950s, but this should not be allowed to obscure the poor treatment it has received in general from, quote, Marxists, end quote. From Marx's death until the 1920s, it fell into almost total oblivion. Engels in his last period paid it no attention, nor did Luxemburg, Lenin, or Kautsky. All founded their condemnation of capitalism on growing pauperization, on difficulties of accumulation, or on the falling rate of profit. The first to revive the, quote, fetishism, end quote, concept in any serious way was Lukács in his History and Class Consciousness of 1923, and only after the Second World War did the notion begin to find a slightly larger following in the Marxist camp. Footnote: another attempt to explore these themes should also be mentioned, Isaac Illich Rubin, Essays on Marxist Theory of Value. This work was first published in Moscow in 1924 and barely noticed at that time. It should be noted that both of those books, Isaac Illich Rubin's Essays on Marxist Theory of Value and Lukács' History and Class Consciousness, were both victims of repression and critique that I'm not much sure about Rubin's situation, even though I should be, because I have a few biographies of Rubin on the channel. But they were they both were victims of bullying of the international communist movement. Or maybe not Rubin, but at least Lukács. So Lukács, I think, I'm not expert on Lukács, but I think immediately recanted or something, like a lot of the shit he said in History and Class Consciousness due to pressure from the party. The international communist movement or whatever. So, and that's why even though Lukács was eventually to become a Stalinist, or at least insufficiently critical of Stalinism, though I think you could say he was a Stalinist. A lot of people do at least say he was a Stalinist. But despite that, his work is part of the Western Marxism canon because it kind of falls outside of the strictures of conventional Marxism-Leninism and Second International Marxism as well. So anyway, where am I? I should put Essays on Marxist Theory of Value on the channel, but I have pieces by Rubin on the channel and a few pieces about Rubin on the channel, so check them out. Where am I? On its first publication, Lukács' book created an uproar in which praise and condemnation were intermingled. In 1924, it was damned by the Third International. Damned by the Third International, and a parallel anathema was issued by German Social Democracy. A few years later, Lukács too distanced himself from his own book, which quickly became at once legendary and impossible to come by, so that few people were able to be influenced by it. But the official demise of Stalinism stimulated the search for a different kind of Marxism, and eventually in 1957 and 1958, a few chapters of this Livre Maudit were published in the French journal Argument. In 1960, a French translation of the entire work appeared over the author's own objections. Lukács, since he manifestly could not prevent the rediscovery of his book, proceeded to authorize a new German edition in 1967, adding a preface that incorporated very significant self-criticism. History and class consciousness attained an almost cult-like status in the 1960s, and it exerted a profound influence on Debord. Clearly, it supplied the initial orientation for his development of Marxian themes. Debord himself does not refer overmuch to this connection. However, Debord's direct quotation of Lukács is confined to 2 sentences, serving as epigraph for the second chapter of the Society of the Spectacle. Elsewhere, he quotes a few lines from the young Hegel's The Difference Between the Philosophical System of Fichte and Schelling, end quote. That would seem to have been taken from Lukács' book. As for Lukács' theories, Debord explicitly evokes only Lukács' concept of the party as that, quote, mediation between theory and practice, end quote, whereby proletarians cease to be, quote, mere quote, spectators, end quote, end quote. And Debord adds that what Lukács is really describing here is, quote, everything that the bracket Bolshevik and bracket party was not, end quote. Footnote. The Situationists nonetheless approved in theory of this conception of organization and strove to apply it to themselves. End footnote. 1 second. I gotta check something. Okay. End footnote. The entire run of the journal International Situationist contains just one reference to Lukács, but the choice of matter quoted is characteristic. Quote, the primacy of the category of totality is the bearer of the principle of revolution in science, end quote. International Situationist. That category is indeed as central for Lukács, whose reiteration of this is one of the very few points where he continues in his 1967 preface to see validity in his book, as it is for Debord. We have seen that in Debord's view, the spectacle is at once economic and ideological in nature, at once a mode of production and a type of everyday life, and so on. The Situationists deemed it necessary to pass a global judgment here, one that could not be dazzled by the variety of choices seemingly on offer within the spectacle. They consequently rejected all change of a partial kind. According to the Society of the Spectacle, the degree of alienation now imposed on them puts workers, quote, in the position of having either to reject, bracket, their impoverishment, end bracket, in its totality, or do nothing at all, end quote. Society of the Spectacle. At least in its, quote, diffuse, end quote, variant, the spectacle always appears in a variety of guises, different political tendencies, contrasting lifestyles, antagonistic artistic attitudes. The spectator is urged to express an opinion or to choose one such false alternative or another, so that he never questions the whole. The Situationists stressed the necessity of rejecting existing conditions in bloc. In fact, they made this attitude into an epistemological principle. Quote, the only possible basis for understanding this world is to oppose this world, and such opposition will be neither genuine nor realistic unless it contests the totality, end quote. Lukács, for his part, explained that the more bourgeois thought succeeded in understanding particular, quote, facts, end quote, about social life, the less bourgeois thought was able to apprehend social life in social life's totality. Footnote. In the context of the present discussion, Lukács refers exclusively to Lukács of history and class consciousness. End footnote. This incapacity corresponded perfectly to the actual fragmentation of social activity, and in particular to the growing compartmentalization of work. Bourgeois science, along with the kind of, quote, vulgar, end quote, Marxism, bourgeois science influence, so typical of the Second International, allowed itself to be misled by such alleged contradictions as that between the economic and political spheres. Only authentic Marxism, and Lukács states explicitly that the method of authentic Marxism was derived from Hegel, was able to identify isolated facts as mere moments of an overarching process. Bourgeois science takes the apparent independence of, quote, things and, quote, facts for the truth and strives to discover the, quote, laws, end quote, that govern them. It looks upon economic crises or wars not as the more or less distorted outcome of human actions, but rather as events obeying their own laws. This science remains prisoner to the commodity fetishism which it is the task of a genuine critique to dispel. This is why, according to Lukács, it may legitimately be said that, quote, the chapter of Capital dealing with the fetish character of the commodity contains within itself the whole of historical materialism, end quote. A truly unheard of assertion in 1923. Lukács uses the term, quote, reification, end quote, to refer to the operation whereby fetishism transforms processes into things. Apropos of the commodity, Lukács maintains that, quote, at this stage in the history of mankind, there is no problem that does not ultimately lead back to that question, and there is no solution that could not be found in the solution to the riddle of the commodity structure, end quote. History and class consciousness. Quote, our intention here, end quote, Lukács announces, quote, is to base ourselves on Marxist economic analyses, end quote. And Lukács sees his personal contribution as an analysis of the commodity as the, quote, universal category, end quote, of total social being. The transition from a society in which the commodity appears only in occasional acts of exchange to a society in which commodities are produced systematically was not a purely quantitative change, as bourgeois economists like to believe. It was also a qualitative transition whereby the commodity was transformed from a simple mediation between productive processes into a central factor in a mode of production whose very character the commodity came to determine. Lukács lays far more emphasis than Marx on the, quote, contemplative, end quote, aspect of capitalism. In Lukács' view, each individual is capable of recognizing no more than the tiniest portion of the world as of his own making, while the vast remainder lies beyond the range of conscious activity and may only be contemplated from afar. This is not to say that, quote, activity, end quote, of a sort, even frenzied and harrowing activity, is impossible. The decisive fact, however, is that the worker's function in the productive process is reduced to a passive role circumscribed by a pre-established plan that unfolds as automatically as a conveyor belt. In contrast to other times, there is but a difference of degree in the reification undergone by the various classes of society. Whoever works must sell his labor power as a thing, and in the case of the bureaucrat, this sale includes brain power. But the entrepreneur contemplates the progress of the economy or the advance of technology. The entrepreneur contemplating the progress of the economy or the advance of technology is likewise reified, as is the technician, quote, faced with the state of science and the profitability of science's application to technology, end quote, history and class consciousness. Under capitalism, every individual is restricted to wresting whatever advantage he can from a system, quote, the laws, quote, the quote, laws, end quote, of which he finds, quote, ready-made, end quote, history and class consciousness. Taking issue directly with Engels, Lukács asserts that industry and scientific experimentation are based on a contemplative attitude towards, quote, facts, end quote, whose actual motion appears as coagulated. Footnote. In his 1967 preface, Lukács vigorously reversed this judgment, asserting that it is, in fact, activity, not passivity, that is characteristic of the bourgeoisie, but one may perfectly well become active, even frantically active, on the basis of a, quote, fact or a quote, law, whose validity one accepts in a passive way, which suggests that history and class consciousness was nearer the mark than its author was later prepared to admit. End footnote. More and more, man becomes a mere passive observer or spectator of the independent movement of commodities, which to him seems like a kind of, quote, second nature, end quote. A phrase also used by Debord in the Society of the Spectacle. Likewise, enveloped in this false consciousness is the, quote, economistic, end quote, version of Marxism, which sees all social changes governed by economic laws. Contemplation is obviously related to separation, since the subject can contemplate only that which is opposed to him inasmuch as it is separate from him. Lukács, far more than Marx, associates reification with the division of labor, a phenomenon that had made, quote, great, quote, progress, end quote, in the half-century that had intervened between Marx's day and Lukács of 1923. Whereas for the medieval artisan, the productive process constituted a, quote, organic, irrational, ... unity, end quote, history and class consciousness, modern productive activities are part of an extended calculation in accordance with which individual tasks that are in themselves meaningless are reassembled by, quote, specialists, end quote. Such fragmented labor is less capable than ever of producing a social bond whereby human beings can encounter one another on an individual and concrete basis. What Debord and Lukács have in common in a specific sense is their unswerving rejection of every form of contemplation which they see as an alienation of the subject. Debord and Lukács both identify subject and activity, and for Debord, contemplation, or, quote, non-intervention, end quote, is the diametrical opposite of life. Quote, there can be no freedom apart from activity, and within the spectacle all activity is banned, end quote. Lukács broadens the critique of the contemplative nature of... Sorry, that quote is from Society of the Spectacle. Lukács broadens the critique of the contemplative nature of capitalist society with a stiff harangue against, quote, the contemplative duality of subject and object, end quote, history and class consciousness. Pre-Hegelian philosophy looked upon the object, whether conceived in idealist fashion as a, quote, thing in itself, end quote, or in the manner of 18th century materialism as an entity separate from and independent of the activity of the subject. It took the Hegelian dialectic to discover that the duality is resolved in the process, and Marx then proceeded to identify this process with the concrete historical process that, quote, truly eliminates the actual autonomy of the objects and the concepts of things with their resulting rigidity, end quote. Indeed, quote, the nature of history is precisely that every definition degenerates into an illusion. History is the history of the unceasing overthrow of the objective forms that shape the life of man, end quote. History and Class Consciousness, Lukács. That was all in italics, so I'm going to repeat that. Indeed, quote, the nature of history is precisely that every definition degenerates into an illusion. History is the history of the unceasing overthrow of the objective forms that shape the life of man, end quote. History and Class Consciousness. Whereas science can only search for, quote, those, quote, laws, end quote, which function in objective reality without the intervention of the subject. Without the intervention of the subject, end quote. History and Class Consciousness. Thus perpetuating the split between subject and object, theory and praxis, the class struggle, by reconstituting the unity of subject and object, will thereby reconstruct the total man. The total man. In the spectacle, a fragmented society is illusorily restored to wholeness. In the spectacle, a fragmented society is illusorily restored to wholeness. And Debord's analysis of this process is the point at which Debord goes beyond history and class consciousness. It is instructive in this regard to compare statements by the two authors. Thus, Lukács writes that, quote, mechanization makes of them, bracket, the workers, end bracket, isolated abstract atoms whose work no longer brings them together directly and organically. Mechanization makes of them, the workers, isolated abstract atoms whose work no longer brings the workers together directly and organically. It becomes mediated to an increasing extent exclusively by the abstract laws of the mechanism which imprisons them, end quote. History and Class Consciousness. And here is Debord. Quote, the generalized separation of worker and product has spelled the end of any comprehensive view of the job done, as well as the end of direct personal communication between producers, ... Consistency and communication become the exclusive assets of the system's managers, end quote. Debord, Society of the Spectacle. Clearly for Debord, quote, abstract laws, end quote, are no longer a pure mediation and have been reorganized into a coherent system. In 1923, Lukács recorded the passing of all totality and implicitly adopted Max Weber's notion of the, quote, disenchantment of the world, end quote. Debord similarly evokes continued global domination by a, quote, banalizing trend. A, quote, banalizing trend, end quote. Debord, Society of the Spectacle. But Debord sees this as arising from a spurious reconstruction of the totality from a totalitarian dictatorship of the fragmentary. This development is particularly striking when Debord extends reification to realms beyond that of work. The young Marx found fault with political economy because political economy saw not the man, but merely the worker, leaving all other aspects to be seen only by, quote, the eyes of doctors, judges, gravediggers, beadles, etc. End quote. Karl Marx Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts, translated by Gregor Benton. I have a piece by Gregor Benton on the Bolshevization of the Chinese Communist Party, if you're interested. I'd recommend Gregor Benton's work just on Chinese Trotskyism in general. It's very, very important, even if you're not a Trotskyist, to understand that history and the way that Stalinism dealt with opposition to itself from a radical left perspective. Dealt with the radical left critique of Stalinism. It was very brutal in China. In contrast, the spectacle, quote, attends to, end quote, the whole man and appears to lavish on him in the spheres of consumption and free time all the attention that in reality is refused him both in the sphere of work and everywhere else. Even dissatisfaction and rebellion are liable to become cogs in the machinery of the spectacle. No genuine mending of splits can occur solely at the level of thought. Only activity can transcend contemplation, and mankind truly knows only what mankind has done. For Lukács, proletarian theory thus has no value save as the quote, has no value save as a quote theory of praxis, end quote, in the process of self-transformation into a quote practical theory that overturns the whole world, end quote. History and class consciousness. Debord likewise asserts that it is, quote, within the historical struggle itself, end quote, that, quote, the theory of praxis, bracket, must be, end bracket, verified by virtue of its transformation into theory and practice, end quote. With Marx, says Debord, the negation of the existing order passes from the theoretical plane to that of, quote, revolutionary practice, the only true agent of that negation, end quote. And then Debord warns that, quote, no idea could transcend the spectacle that exists. It could only transcend ideas that exist about the spectacle, end quote. Debord is merely summing up one of the favorite themes of international Situationists, which was continually rebuking all proprietors of more or less exact truths for failing to test them practically. The real philosophical pivot of history and class consciousness, the book, is the demand that the subject countenance no independent object apart from the subject's self. In other words, Lukács' work theorizes an identity of subject and object. This is also one of the main reasons why the later Lukács rejected his own work. In his preface of 1967, Lukács denounced the notion of an identical subject-object as hopelessly idealist in character, since it sought to abolish all objectivity along with alienation. The conception of alienation proposed in history and class consciousness unknowingly implied an acceptance of the Hegelian identification of subject and object, and failed to take into account the Marxian definition of objectification. Quote, a natural means by which man masters the world, and as such it can be either a positive or a negative fact. By contrast, alienation is a special variant of that activity which becomes operative in definite social conditions, end quote. History and class consciousness. All work involves objectification, and so too does language. Alienation on the one hand occurs only when, quote, the essence of man, bracket, comes, end bracket, into conflict with his existence, end quote. History and class consciousness. To my understanding, that's basically the Hegelian, what is being critiqued here, or clarified here, is the distinction between alienation in Marx and alienation in Hegel. To my understanding of Hegel, which is not great, that was how Hegel characterized alienation as like a manifestation of human will onto something outside of itself, I believe. So you're alienating your powers or something like that when you create a table or something like that, which kind of makes alienation a trans-historical fact of life if that's how alienation is conceived. The Marxian conception of alienation is something that is social in character, that is not reducible to just human creation as such, but human creation, human activity within, with specific social determinations pressing down on it. Where the fuck am I? All works involve objectification, and so too does language. Alienation, on the other hand, occurs only when, quote, the essence of man comes into conflict with man's existence, end quote, history and class consciousness. By identifying the two notions, history and class consciousness unintentionally defined alienation as, quote, an eternal, quote, condition humane, end quote, a, quote, fundamental and crude error, end quote, according to the later Lukács, which, quote, certainly contributed greatly, end quote, to the book's success, as likewise to the rise of German and French existentialism. In point of fact, the critique of capitalist alienation and that of simple objectivity coexist in history and class consciousness, and it is very difficult to disentangle the critique of capitalist alienation and that of simple objectivity. It is reasonable to inquire, therefore, to what extent a similar unintended confusion is to be found in Debord's work. The need to draw a distinction between alienation and objectification was, of course, clearly felt well before 1967. Suffice it to recall the publication in 1932 of the economic and philosophical manuscripts, where Marx argues that for Hegel, alienation was identical to the objectification of the spirit, and hence as necessary as it was transient. Debord was, in fact, at pains to avoid Lukács', quote, fundamental and crude error, end quote. Debord reminds us that Marx emancipated himself from the, quote, unfolding of the Hegelian spirit on the Hegelian spirit's way to the Hegelian spirit's rendezvous with the Hegelian spirit's self in time, the Hegelian spirit's objectification being indistinguishable from the Hegelian spirit's alienation, end quote, Society of the Spectacle. Debord certainly does not define objectification as something necessarily bad, so far from rejecting the loss of the subject and the shifting objectifications which time brings, and from which the subject is liable to emerge enriched. Debord hails this as a genuinely human phenomenon, the complete opposite of the alienation that confronts the subject with hypostatized abstractions that are absolutely other. Quote, as Hegel showed, time is a necessary alienation, the medium in which the subject realizes the subject self while losing the subject self, ... The opposite obtains in the case of the alienation that now holds sway, ... This is a spatial alienation, whereby a society which radically severs the subject from the activity that society steals from the subject, separates the subject in the first place from the subject's own time. Social alienation, though in principle surmountable, is nevertheless the alienation that has forbidden and petrified the possibilities and risks of a living alienation within time, end quote. Society of the Spectacle. For Debord, as for Lukács before Debord, one of the fundamental modes of reification is the spatialization of time. Footnote, some observations on this subject will be found in Martin J. Downcast Eyes, the Denigration of Vision in 20th Century French Thought, Chapter 7 of which is entitled From the Empire of the Gaze to the Society of the Spectacle, Foucault and Debord. A somewhat less superficial account might have been expected from J., a historian of philosophy well known for his work on the Frankfurt School. It is certainly worth noting, however, how quickly Debord seems to be losing his, quote, marginality, end quote, in the eyes of the academic world. End footnote. Using Hegelian terms, as Debord acknowledges, Debord contrasts, quote, end footnote. Using Hegelian terms, as Debord acknowledges, Debord contrasts, quote, restless becoming in the progression of time, end quote, i.e., quote, necessary alienation, end quote, from a space characterized by the absence of movement. On several occasions, Debord observes that the situationist attitude consisted in identifying oneself with the passage of time. Like the Lukács of history and class consciousness, Debord was led to assume that reification clashes with a subject that is in that subject's essence immune to reification. I think that's what's being said here. It says Debord was led to assume that reification clashes with a subject that is in its essence immune to it. I'm assuming I'm filling in the pronouns correctly. I often fill in the pronouns if you're not used to listening to hear me talk because sometimes, at least when I'm reading something, if they use the word it, that, or this, or something like that too many times, I lose track of what the hell they're referring to. So I kind of like follow it along. I kind of like try to say what I think the specific word the pronoun is referring to, even if it sounds redundant and a little silly. For purposes of clarification, it seems absolutely necessary. Such a subject, even one existing here and now, must be at least in part the bearer of demands and desires different from those created by reification. What seems to be entirely absent from either history and class consciousness or the society of the spectacle is any hint that the subject might be under attack within itself from forces of alienation capable of conditioning the subject's unconscious in such a way as to cause the subject to identify actively with the system in which the subject finds itself. According to the Situationists, no doubt Debord was the least naive in this regard. It would suffice for empirical subjects to reach understanding amongst themselves without intermediaries in order for them to arrive at revolutionary positions. Debord seems to conceive of the spectacle as a force exerted from without upon, quote, life. Indeed, Debord asserts that the spectacle is the society itself and at the same time just a part of that society. Although the spectacle tends to invade, quote, lived reality, end quote, the lived reality remains distinct from the spectacle, even the opposite of the spectacle. There must, after all, be such a thing as a substantially, quote, healthy, end quote, subject. Otherwise, it would make no sense to speak of the, quote, falsification, end quote, of a subject's activity. Inasmuch as Debord describes the subject's world as a distorted reflection of the subject, then it is not the subject that is alienated, but that world. Yet the objective world would have no independent existence if the objective world were merely a, quote, faithful reflection, end quote, of its product. We seem to be back in the presence of Lukács', quote, identical subject-object, end quote. I was talking one time to this guy. Never mind. I was just going to say I was talking to this guy from on like a Council Communist, like Discord or something like that. And he was kind of talking about how, like, the Frankfurt School was kind of like a critique in some sense of like the kind of like, I guess, naive conceptions of class consciousness or something like that. And like the penetration of like, by the subject of the society in which they exist, right? Whereas for a lot of, like, I guess, council communists in like the traditional like sense of that word, not people influenced by it or people who believe in like council communism, but as one of its like inessential but actual, like not inessential in the sense of not important, but like maybe it's kind of in its core, but like the idea of like the simplicity of like the clarity of like the emancipatory, the necessarily emancipatory strivings of the proletariat is critiqued by the Frankfurt School, something like that. And I thought that was I'm describing what I'm saying purely badly. I don't even know if I've described it, but like the critique of this kind of like naive conception of class consciousness being like always right there about to be expressed, whereas like the Frankfurt School kind of like just, and like I guess like a lot of people influenced by Freud discuss the way that like power becomes internalized in subjects, including oppressed subjects, and that a substantial theory of revolution today would have to take into account those insights. I guess is what I'm trying to say. I don't know what I'm trying to say. Maybe I'm trying to say nothing. I just want to sound smart. Okay. Where the fuck am I? Debord identifies the reification-resisting subject with the proletariat, just as Lukács did in History and Class Consciousness. Both authors locate the essence of the proletariat not in economic conditions, but in the proletariat's opposition to reification. For Lukács, class consciousness is not an empirical datum that may be found immediately in the class as a whole, or even in each proletarian. Instead, class consciousness is a datum in itself that is assigned de jure to the proletarian class. Although reification affects all classes, the bourgeoisie is not uncomfortable with this situation of reification for the simple reason that the rule of the commodity is also the bourgeoisie's rule. The only class with an interest in the transcendence of reification is the proletariat, because the worker always finds the worker's self, no matter what, to be the object of events. Inasmuch as he is obliged to sell his labor power as a commodity, the worker himself is inevitably capitalism's main commodity. At the same time, inasmuch as he is aware of being reduced to a mere object of the labor process, the proletarian may eventually realize that he is in reality the author or subject of that process. Hence his, quote, consciousness is the self-consciousness of the commodity, end quote. Hence, quote, his consciousness is the self-consciousness of the commodity, end quote. Thus, reification is destined to be transcended precisely when reification reaches reification's highest level. Once every human element has been taken away from the life of the proletariat, that class will, by the same token, be able to see clearly what every, quote, objectification, end quote, embodies. That every, quote, objectification, end quote, embodies a relationship between men that is mediated by things. Starting from the most obvious form of reification, the relationship between wage, labor, and capital, the proletariat will eventually discover all its other forms, and it will find itself unable to abandon this path until it has reconstituted the totality. That, quote, total process, uncontaminated by any trace of reification, which allows the process-like essence to prevail in all its purity, and which represents, the authentic higher reality, end quote. Georg Lukács. Almost alone among observers in the 1960s, Debord insists that the proletariat continues to exist, and Debord describes it as, quote, the vast mass of workers who have lost all power over the use of their own lives, end quote, Debord. Proletarians are, quote, people who have no possibility of altering the social space-time that society allots for their consumption, end quote. Both Lukács and Debord emphasize that in modern society, the condition of the proletariat, so long as this is not defined solely in terms of wages, is in the process of becoming the condition of the entire society. The subordination of all aspects to life to the exigencies of the commodity, to the laws of calculation and quantification, means that, quote, the fate of the worker, end quote, that is to say, reification, quote, becomes the fate of society as a whole, end quote. History and Class Consciousness. Debord, for his part, writes that, quote, the triumph of an economic system founded on separation leads to the proletarianization of the world, end quote. Thus, a good portion of the work of the middle classes is now carried out under proletarian conditions, and the proletariat is de facto larger than ever. Footnote, 20 years later, in Comments on the Society of the Spectacle, Debord reversed the terms of this proposition. He now saw the middle classes, of whom Debord had originally said that they would be absorbed in the proletariat, as occupying the whole of social space, the role of the spectacle being their expression. Although the conditions of their lives had been proletarianized and that they had no power over those lives, they lacked the class consciousness of the proletariat. From this point of view, therefore, even Debord eventually admitted that the proletarian class had been absorbed by the middle class. End footnote. Where am I? Even assuming that purely economic demands could be met, the spectacle can never offer a qualitatively rich life, for its very foundation is quantity and banality. The proletariat is deprived not only of material wealth, but also of all the possibilities of human enrichment that it likewise creates. The spectacle excludes it by definition from access to the entire range of humanity's products, thus prohibiting it from putting into free play what the economy of the spectacle uses to foster the unrelenting growth of its alienated and alienating production system. This is why the proletariat turns out to be the enemy of what exists, and the, quote, negative at work, end quote, regardless of any quantitative increase that might be made in the doling out of survival. In face of the totality of the spectacle, the project of the proletariat cannot but be total itself, nor can it be confined to some, quote, redistribution of wealth, end quote, or some, quote, democratization, end quote, of society. The real social contradiction is therefore that between those who want, or rather those who are obliged to maintain alienation, and those who would abolish alienation, between those who cannot, either in thought or in action, transcend the subject-object split, and those whose thought and action tend, on the contrary, towards such a transcendence. The great importance assigned by the Situationists to, quote, subjective, end quote, factors led them to place significantly more stress on the manifestations of false consciousness, on the bureaucratic character of workers' parties, for instance. It also allowed them to play down the significance of facts that seemed to contradict their theory. It made it easy, notably, to assume that the proletariat is revolutionary in the proletariat's essence, or in the proletariat itself, if the proletariat does not demonstrate its revolutionary character in a flagrant way, even if almost all of its concrete actions have to be viewed as, quote, reformist, end quote, the reason can be said to be that the class has simply not yet attained its being for itself. Its being for itself, not yet arrived at a consciousness of its true being, an account of its illusions, and through the fault of those with an interest in manipulating those illusions. The question is not to determine what the workers are at present, but rather what the workers can become. For only thus is it possible to grasp that what in truth they already are. To grasp in truth what they already are. Such an account is clearly very general and a far cry from Marx's, according to which the proletariat is a revolutionary class, not just because the proletariat has the most serious reasons for dissatisfaction, but also because the proletariat's place in the production process, the proletariat's cohesion, the proletariat's massive concentration in the particular areas together give the proletariat the means to overthrow the existing order. I feel like it would be helpful here, and I don't know if Debord's Jappe is going to talk about it, but Debord is definitely coming, from my understanding of Debord, and I'm not writing the book, but my understanding of Debord is that he's definitely coming from like a council communist kind of tradition, even though obviously he's an innovator and not just a person who's just like reciting truths pre-established by previous thinkers. He's definitely coming out of the council communist tradition, and I think extremely important for Debord and for like the libertarian left in France in the 1960s and prior, in the heyday of the Situationist International. Very important for that was the journal Situationist International and the work of Cornelius Castoriadis, writing under various pseudonyms at that time. The Castoriadis was very influential, not just to my understanding at least. I'm not someone who knows more about the Situationists. The Situationist International would have had to have been, whether it was acknowledged or not, an extreme influence on the Situationists. Also, I think important, what I definitely know is that Cornelius Castoriadis and Situationist International were extremely influential on the Daniel Cohn-Bendit, and the Daniel Cohn-Bendit and the I think he has a brother. Did he have a brother? Is it Gabriel Cohn-Bendit as well? But he was very influential. The fucking helicopter and the wind's blowing, so you probably can't hear me very good, but that's okay. You'll have to live through it. But I think that their book, Obsolete Communism, was extremely influenced by Socialism and Barbarie, and I don't think they had very many qualms about like just straight up lifting social analysis straight from Socialism and Barbarie in the book Obsolete Communism. I'm not an expert on either of those people. I'm not expert on Cohn-Bendit or Debord, but I know that Socialism and Barbarie's influence at this time was extreme. Not just, for one thing, Socialism and Barbarie was kind of like a place that was like a ground for all kinds of people of like the radical dissident left, whether it be council communists or anarchists or Bordigists or former Trotskyists, which is the case with Castoriadis and Claude Lafleur at this time. But it was kind of like a a lot of meeting of critical minds at a certain point, and their influence throughout the radical left milieu was tremendous. The critical left milieu, obviously, Trotskyism, communism with a capital C, and eventually Maoism would come to have a big influence as well on the student left and the radical left of the 1960s. But Socialisme Barbarie was a big thing, and Socialisme Barbarie definitely had a very, very much a view of had a lot of optimism about the capacity of the working class for self-activity and not just trade union self-activity, but substantial direct democratic socialist self-activity, which to my understanding, leaked into all quarters of the radical left thought at this time. The more like psychoanalytic informed critical Marxism at this time, I think, would have been like pretty limited. And like, I don't know, obviously psychoanalysis had a big influence in France at this time, but I don't know how it would have manifested itself, if at all, in 60s France. Like, I don't know, did Lacan have any influence on the libertarian left in 60s France? I don't know. I know Castoriadis eventually went on to become like he became like a psychoanalyst. He had a couple hats. He had a psychoanalyst hat, and he had his economist hat. He had his philosopher hat, and in his psychoanalyst hat, I think he had like a very, very strong critiques of Lacanian psychoanalysis. I don't know what they were because I don't know shit about psychoanalysis really. But I don't think he would have had the same kind of like I don't know if like the ideas, like say for instance of like Adorno or someone like that, would have had as much influence, and Horkheimer would have had as much influence on the dissident student left at this time, or not the dissident left, the critical Marxist left at this time. Sorry, I was talking way too much there. Or was I? Such an account is clearly very general and a far cry from Marx's, according to which the proletariat is the revolutionary class, not just because it has the most serious reasons for dissatisfaction, but also because its place in the production process, its cohesion, and its massive concentration in particular areas together give it the means to overthrow the existing order. For Debord, the concrete form assumed by the proletariat qua identical subject-object is that of workers' councils, thanks to which proletarians can first conduct the struggle and later organize a future free society. Around 1920, Lukács too sympathized with the idea of workers' councils, having participated in the Hungarian Council Republic, or Commune of 1919. In workers' councils, activity in the first person is supposed to replace mere contemplation of the actions of a party or leader. Quote, in the power of workers' councils, ... the proletarian movement becomes its own product. This product is the producer himself, end quote. Society of the Spectacle. Here, all separation and all specialization are abolished, for revolutionary workers' councils vest, quote, all decision-making and executive powers in themselves, end quote. Society of the Spectacle. The power of such councils will, quote, transform the totality of existing conditions, end quote, for it aspires to, quote, recognize itself in a world of its own design, end quote. Debord, Society of the Spectacle. In the historical process, according to the Society of the Spectacle, subject and object are already identical in themselves. Historical struggle is the struggle to make the subject and object coincide for themselves. Modern history, quote, has no goal aside from what affects modern history's works upon itself. As for the subject of history, it can only be the self-production of the living becoming master and possessor of the living's world, that is, of history, end quote. Society of the Spectacle. This, quote, becoming master, end quote, must emphatically not be taken as implying that the development of the forces of production brings first the bourgeoisie then the proletariat to power. The most serious reproach directed at Marx in the Society of the Spectacle is that he capitulated, quote, as early as the Manifesto, end quote, to a linear view of history that, quote, identifies the proletariat with the bourgeoisie with respect to the revolutionary seizure of power, end quote. Debord. The fact is that, quote, the bourgeoisie is the only revolutionary class ever to have become victorious, end quote. That its victory in the political sphere was a consequence of the bourgeoisie's prior victory in the sphere of material production. Society of the Spectacle. Given that its economy and its state are nothing but alienations and the negation of all conscious life, the task of the proletariat can in no sense be to seize hold of those same instruments, the result of which could only be a new enslavement like that already established in Russia and other countries. Debord joins Lukács in opposition to a purely scientific explanation of history. The motor of history for both authors is the class struggle, but this struggle is not a pure reflection of economic processes. Debord expresses his approval of Marx's assertion that, quote, it is the struggle, and by no means the law, that must be understood, end quote. A formulation that would be equally at home in history and class consciousness. And in the same context, he immediately quotes Marx and Engels' well-known statement in The German Ideology, quote, we know only a single science, the science of history, end quote. Marx and Engels cited in Society of the Spectacle. In Debord's view, the Marxian attempt to draw lessons with a scientific value from failed revolutions of the past merely opened the door to the later degeneration represented by working class bureaucracies. Instead of placing itself under the leadership of one chief or another, or trusting to the unfolding of what appears to be a natural process, what is really required is the organization of the, quote, practical conditions of consciousness, end quote, of proletarian action. Society of the Spectacle, Section 90. I'm sorry that it got so loud in the middle of this recording. The wind really picked up and there was a helicopter circling overhead. So hopefully this recording is not absolutely unbearable to listen to. And if you made it this far, I thank you for listening.